Well, joining me now is Kholofelo Kugler, Head of Trade Law in Besso, Switzerland. Good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Now, what are the legal implications of the US imposing a 30% tariff on South African exports under World Trade Organization rules? And could South Africa challenge this tariff as a violation of international trade agreements?
Well, I think that assessment really has to do with the amount of the US's import tariff rate per product, so it has to be on a product level. But as we know, the average tariff rate of the US is quite low. And so to the extent that any tariff exceeds, the US's bound rates, which is basically where the US has committed itself that it would not exceed the tariff, then obviously any country can challenge this measure at the WTO, of course, including South Africa.
Now, how does the US tariff policy, particularly the claim of addressing reciprocal trade imbalances, align with or deviate from established trade law principles? And what precedents exist for such unilateral tariff actions?
I think what we need to appreciate from the work that the WTO has done, and of course the predecessor, the GATT, was to decrease tariff across the board. And of course, there are principles that I just mentioned before, the most favored nation principle that says that you have to treat all countries essentially the same. And so to the extent that some countries have got a lower tariff rate than the others, arguably this would be exactly against this principle. Obviously, this type of sort of really wide-ranging tariff measures are unprecedented. This has not been seen before. This is even arguably sort of worse than what we saw in 2017, 2018 in Trump 1, where there were these Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. So this is really unprecedented, and arguably, some countries could challenge some of these measures at the WTO.
Now, what specific trade law strategies or countermeasures could South Africa pursue to mitigate the impact of those 30% tariffs, such as maybe negotiating exemptions, retaliatory tariffs, or leveraging regional agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Mm-hmm. I think the president was very clear in explaining that these negotiations are ongoing. And I think it was also mentioned that at least countries know where they stand. I mean, South Africa has got that 30% additional tariff rate, and this is where we are. But besides ongoing negotiations with the United States, of which we have no guarantee of the outcome, of course, a huge opportunity for South Africa is regional trade growth. I think this African Continental Free Trade Area is a huge opportunity, not only for South Africa, but for the whole continent at large. And I think it's really the time is now that we leverage the collective power on the continent and to sort of try to build resilience, as the presidents were saying, not only for the South African economy, of course, but also for African countries that were also affected by these measures. I mean, Algeria, for example, has got a 20% tariff. That's not very low. So I think there's, quite a few options. And of course, diversifying export partners. We have to, remember that the US takes about 7% of South Africa's export. It's not a huge trading partner, but it's a very valuable trading partner.
Of course, we have to talk about AGOA, that's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. How does the potential expiration or nullification of that act due to these tariffs affect South Africa's trade law obligations and opportunities with the US, and what alternative frameworks could replace those benefits, those AGOA benefits?
True. I mean, as we know, AGOA is actually on its last leg. If it's not extended, it will expire on the 30th of September, which is essentially next month. There's been multiple attempts to renew it, to revitalize it, to extend it, but it was not extended under Biden. And so in the current, circumstance, in the current regime, we don't know the way forward. We do know that the Trump administration offers a more transactional type of trade deal, which could work out for some African countries, including South Africa, because of the critical minerals. We are an exporter of minerals in general. But currently, I think without any sort of feedback from Washington, D.C., this has been something that I've been tracking personally for a while, we don't know what the framework would be. Of course, unilateral trade preference schemes like AGOA are risky for countries that are the beneficiaries. I mean, we know that South Africa has been on the chopping block several times. And so it perhaps might be worth thinking about more predictable trade deals where there's reciprocal commitments made from both sides that are a little bit more balanced than the unilateral deals that we're seeing with AGOA.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Yeah, of course, the AGOA Trade Act, that agreement coming up for renewal in September, or maybe not. Anyway, that was Kholofelo Kugler, Head of Trade Law, Besso, Switzerland, chatting to us there.